All right. Hello, guys. This is the second freestyle lecture of this series. The first one was an introduction to epistolution and a general overview of where I am in terms of describing the proof for it and how it sort of fits into the general theory of evolution and what sort of lines of reasoning require us to believe in evolution and search for the answer to how it works. I discussed my theory of oscillators a little bit. So I'm going to leave all that where it is for now and go straight into some of the consequences of this theory. What I'm planning to do is have some question and answer sessions that relate to each of these first two introductory videos, where I just answer have a Zoom call with a friend or two, and they sort of quiz me on the questions that came up for them as they watch these videos. So that'll be exciting, much more down to earth, and I think it'll anchor people a little better in what I'm talking about, because this stuff is pretty heady. It's hard to get your mind around, and I've been working on it for a long time, and this is probably one of your first encounters with it. So I want it to be pleasurable for you, the viewer. Oh, this lecture about consequences is going to be focused on three areas where there are major conceptual consequences from epistolution. These three things don't really depend on my theory of oscillators being right. That could be wrong. It could be, I doubt that it's completely wrong, but it could be sort of completely wrong. Epistolution itself is definitely not completely wrong, though. It's definitely something that is going to become more and more important in our theories of life in the future. And I'm extremely lucky to be here at the very beginning and be one of the first, to my knowledge, that's sort of grappling with this stuff. Probably not the only one, but I'm the only one I can find. So we'll see as this community grows in the future, what all its antecedents will be. But heady days, early days right now. Interesting stuff. Powerful stuff. I'm not going to get into optimism too much in this lecture because I kind of need to lay the groundwork for why there might be optimism. I think I'm going to make a separate third lecture that deals directly with optimism and sort of the personal point of view that people should take from this all, and like how we should sort of put it in our hearts, and like how it should sort of feel to us spiritually, at least how it feels to me spiritually, and sort of emotional depth of it. But these first two lectures are just kind of technical. They're technically about what this theory is and what it means. So there goes the first consequence I want to talk about is what I call incumulation. The consequence of epistolution that happens somehow. Incumulation is just the way that reality, things in the world, extrinsic conditions outside of a cell get incorporated into the cell and reorganize the cell so that it behaves differently. Learning. So it's learning. This is incumulation. The reason I have a new word for it, made up a new word called incumulation, is that it's opposed to a way of thinking of learning and knowledge and the instructions for life in general that is common. And this is a deep assumption that's common across the biological sciences, and math and physics are based on this assumption. And this assumption has held true in physics. It's been very useful in physics, and in the non-biological sciences, it's given us all the progress that we see in computing robotics and engineering of all sorts, and dealing with abiotic stuff, it works great. So that the concept of emergence is what I'm talking about, this base underlying assumption about the world. And I want to oppose that to incumulation. So incumulation does not apply to abiotic material. Abiotic material does not incumulate. It doesn't draw knowledge from its environment. It's not organized in an intelligent way. Abiotic material is just existing in the world. It's pushed around by the forces of the universe, but those forces don't accumulate any sort of progressive or additive synthesis of reality. And they don't, they're not alive. That's why they're abiotic. So the process of life, in my view, is the process of creating knowledge. Being is for knowing. It's the purpose of life. It's how life comes to be in the first place. It's how evolution got started. So you need a process of incumulation in order for natural selection to begin, because incumulation is what holds biotic material together in a living state. It's what holds, it's the preconditions for life. It's sometimes called self-organization, but that doesn't get at it. And I'll try to explain why. So most of the existing thought about how organisms stay organized is based on this genes first view. It's based on the idea that there are particular molecules inside cells, inside the nucleus, that contain instructions. These small, tiny molecule. So the DNA molecule, if it was coiled up if it was the size of a football, it's much smaller than that, teeny tiny. But if it was the size of a football, the rest of the cell would be the size of Central Park. So it's very small, very compact molecule inside the middle of the nucleus of the cell, right? And that is where it's supposed that the instructions for life are written. In my previous video, my first video, I talked about why that can't be true. That's definitely not the case. The instructions definitely come from outside the cell. It comes from the whole cellular system, and they're drawn from outside the cell, and they're accumulated in the cell, or in the organism as a whole, right? In a big group of cells, in the case of multicellular organism. And maybe later we'll talk about selfhood, biological selfhood. So an accumulated object that embodies knowledge is right now only living material can do this. But that is a self, right? It's some form of a self. It's impossible to think. So people think of self as like this psychological concept, which is to some extent, but it's way deeper and more important than that. It's impossible to think about living organisms of any sort without identifying what the self is, the biological self. I mean, the immune system of an organism distinguishes between self and non-self, and attacks non-self and drives it out or kills it, and retains and nurtures self. In multicellular creatures, when the cells become a group, initially it's a single cell, and then the lines of reproductive cells in a developing multicellular organism, they diverge, but they continue cooperating. And the way that they cooperate together is by recognizing themselves as a group, as a self. And so each of them take different roles. They, some of them handle metabolism and digestion, some of them handle locomotion, some handle vision, all sorts of different things, right? But they work together as a self. And if they didn't, the organism, multicellular life, couldn't possibly exist. So the concept of the self is intrinsic. in biology, and a self is an accumulated object. It's something that's taken some knowledge, drawn some knowledge out of its world. It's outward facing. It's organized according to what's external to it. It's not organized according to what's inside it. So the inside is a flexible, malleable group of particles. How this happens, we don't know yet. But emergence is the opposite idea. Emergence is that there's this code in the inside that the small parts organize the whole system, right? So incumulation is the idea that the big stuff organizes the small stuff. That the big picture organizes the details. And that's hard for many people to get their mind around. It's definitely hard to test. It's hard to devise experiments that are sensible, but it's easily, the concept is easily accessible from philosophy, but you have a hard time deriving much insight from experiment here because we're dealing with such intricacy, right? The nice thing about the emergence view is that when you attribute all the intelligence to emergent patterns, you can manipulate the details and have an effect on the big picture. And if you assume that it's the sum of the details that create the big picture, then you think you've got the answer. But we've been trying that for a long time, and we haven't achieved any sort of mastery over biology. Not to say that manipulating genes has no effect on organisms. Of course it does, tremendous effects. But genes don't provide the logic that instructs the organism how to self-organize. So we can't take a stem cell and cause it to follow any particular path with any regularity. It's very difficult to do that. We certainly can't create a self. We can't create an incumulating object. We can't create anything that draws knowledge of its context out of its environment and embodies any sort of intelligence about that. We can get into the AI thing later or somewhere else about why AI, people in the field of AI think that they're doing this, but they're not. What they're doing is they're creating instruments that are incredibly sophisticated at symbolically representing knowledge that humans have, that the programmers have, essentially, that they're putting into the object. So they're not creating intelligence. They're just writing code. They're writing machines that are not intelligent, but their theory is that intelligence is emergent, that it's driven by the details. And so it's natural for them to think that a computer can be intelligent because they don't understand incumulation. They've never imagined incumulation with any specificity. They haven't paid attention to the examples we have of it and how they're fundamentally different from an object that is intended to be an emergent system, like a computer algorithm, like a machine. Machine intelligence is emergent. Machine intelligence is emergent, and that direction of causality doesn't produce an awareness of context. And the way you can show this just through argument, through logical analysis here, is just to follow the Chinese room argument. So this is an argument introduced by John Searle a long time ago, I think maybe in the 80s. And the idea he proposed is he's trying to describe what's wrong with this view that machine intelligence is akin to biological intelligence. And so he said, imagine that there's a room, and inside it there's a person with a bunch of lists. And they've got lists of, characters in Chinese and lists of words in English. And suppose they don't speak either language. They don't know what they don't know what the words mean. But they get handed pieces of paper through a little slot in the door, and they're, the paper contains lists of Chinese characters, and they match these Chinese characters to the English words, and then they hand back the answer back through the slot in the door. And they don't know English or Chinese, and they also don't know anything about what's going on outside the world, in the world. They don't know what the sentences mean. They have no knowledge of their context. All they've done is syntactical matching. There's no semantical meaning being associated with these symbols. They're just syntactically matching them and transferring one symbol over to another. And that's exactly what all machine intelligence is doing. So there's no integrative function there. There's nothing that's drawing a context and integrating it into a system that can produce solutions creatively. And so philosophers like David Deutsch have taken that point of view and extended it and sort of, said it much better than I've just said it. And I believe their arguments. I believe that there is no such thing as a machine intelligence that is creating knowledge. It's just reflecting knowledge that's already been integrated by humans in a syntactical matching scheme that is a powerful tool, certainly, but is not a force for creativity, and it's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the opposite direction. So emergence, an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, computers work because every single detail of their code is executed perfectly. And if even one or zero, any bit is out of place, the whole program can crash. I mean, every detail has to be in place for the computer program to function correctly. And so we have tremendous engineering behind that makes sure that happens. An organism is nothing like that. There's nothing precise inside an organism. It's changing all the time. It's in constant flux in response to its environment. Okay. It's constantly integrating what's going on outside and using that to drive and control the functions inside and change them. They're extremely malleable based on the conditions, and that's incumulated knowledge that's controlling that process and keeping us alive, keeping every living being alive. So that's inward directed. Incumulation is inward. Okay. Emergence is details repeated or elaborated with very intense precision that has effects outward. That's emergence. Fundamentally different process. It's only a metaphor that calls it machine intelligence, right? The original word intelligence was applied to biology, and we now can see that those are fundamentally different processes. So it's important not to get those confused. And incumulation is something that is mysterious. We don't know exactly how it works. In the previous video, I talked a little bit about my theory of oscillators and the blind search, and that has to be part of it. It doesn't have to be. I could be wrong about that stuff, but epistolution definitely happens. There's no question that organisms have intelligence, and we wouldn't be having this communication if it wasn't true. So there's no doubt that it happens. And there's no doubt in my mind that it can't possibly be emergent because of the evidence I showed about why the genes have to be a library rather than instructional. They're not, they're tools, they're instruments, but they're not instructions. So that's the first consequence, is incumulation. The second consequence is called acceleration. Acceleration is very scary. It's very intense. If you've ever become acquainted with compound interest or any sort of geometric exponential curve, you quickly realize that compounded changes begin to compound incredibly fast over time. And knowledge is one of those things. So the knowledge that's been accumulated in organisms has been exponentially increasing over geologic time, over the whole history of, in my view, over the whole history of life. But now it's gotten faster and faster. And the more it accumulates, the faster it goes, right? So there's a tremendously powerful explanation of the acceleration of information technology, which is sort of a proxy for accumulated knowledge, in Ray Kurzweil's work. So Ray Kurzweil is this techno-futurist guy who talks a lot about Moore's law. And so Moore's law is the number of switches on an integrated circuit roughly doubles every 2 years. And this is something that's held true in computing since the 1970s. And it's continuing to hold true. But they're saying like, oh, well, it's going to reach physical limits. But then they've invented quantum computers. So, those physical limits turn out not to be limits. And I doubt that this process, which has been going on certainly since the beginning of human writing, and I believe it's been going on since the beginning of genetic templates, which is 4 billion years ago. I believe that this process is unstoppable. I believe that the intrinsic incumulative process that is life, what it is to be alive, is to be in search of knowledge and to be accumulating that knowledge. We can't stop doing it, and it's going to be cumulative, and it's going to accelerate the pace of change in our world. And it's very scary. I spent a lot of my life being a totally anti-technology type person, a Luddite. I was known as a Luddite among my friends, and I didn't have a cell phone until after college. And I didn't type any papers the first couple of years of college. I handwrote my papers in college, and that was in 2001. So and one of the reasons I used for justifying that behavior was that I felt that technology was this runaway train. I kind of realized early on, like when I was about 14 or 13, that if technology increases exponentially, those changes we're having to cope with that with the basic biological setup that doesn't change at all. It hasn't changed very much in 1.5 million years since we were, Homo erectus. And so this biological organism is not necessarily perfectly tuned to dealing with the type of world that we're living in, that technology is providing for us. But so that's really scary to think how fast the world can change, and it certainly is changing very rapidly now, and much more rapidly than it ever has changed before. And that pace of change if you look at Kurzweil's work, he traces that pace of change, the degree to which, the percentage to which the acceleration happens has been very stable, very predictable over time. Actually, since the beginning of recorded history, the pace of change has stayed the same. And if you keep the pace of compound interest the same, what you get is a higher and higher interest every year, right? So you get a faster and faster acceleration, and the rate of acceleration staying the same means the rate of speed just becomes incredibly fast, and at some point it's basically vertical. And so Kurzweil calls that point at which the pace of technological change is basically vertical, which would mean almost infinitely fast. Vertical would be infinitely fast pace of change. Of course, it's never going to quite get to perfectly vertical. You're not going to see an infinitely fast pace of change. You're going to see really, really scary fast. He calls that the singularity, and he dates the occurrence of this singularity based on his research and his interpretation of what's going to happen in the future. He puts the date of this singularity at somewhere between, I think, 2032 and 2040. So maybe 2035 is a reasonable estimate for this point at which technology is accelerating so fast that it feels vertical. It feels like just an explosion. And that's pretty damn soon, guys. That's only 13 years from now. I don't find it completely implausible that we're going to experience something that's just incredibly game-changing between now and then. And by 2040, we'll be living in some kind of vertically accelerating explosion of knowledge. That's acceleration. So maybe now I should get into a bit of the moral stuff. Because the third thing I'm going to talk about, the third consequence of epistolution is equalitarianism. So we had incumulation, acceleration, and equalitarianism. So that's the third one. Equalitarianism is based on two things. So it's based on the recognition that organisms of a similar type compete with one another, and competitions always involve two things. They involve a win and loss situation. Something wins and something loses, and it also involves spread. The spread of something that pertained to the winner to the rest of the population somehow, in order for the playing field to be equalized enough that competition can continue. Because if there's a win and a loss and nothing is shared between the winner and the rest of the population, the competition comes to an end. The winner takes all, and the rest, everyone else dies or goes extinct, whatever, disappears. And that's not really the case in natural competition. What you see is that, well, there's certainly natural selection, but you see competition continue because the winner spreads their genes, right? The genes spread through the population. The winning genes spread through the population. And you also see that with humans, right? So human society also develops knowledge, and it helps people compete and win money or good things that we desire. And then the ability to use those same things is communicable, so others can learn from people winning, and they can try it themselves and get better at doing the same activities that won, and then they can have a chance to win, right? And this persists over time. So you have a competitive situation between human individuals in the same way. And so my addition to this, so I have developed a lot of the theory around incumulation, and I've developed none of the theory around acceleration. That's all Kurzweil, basically. I just believe that he's right. But equalitarianism, I have like some thoughts here, and I've developed a point of view about it that I think is useful. It's really important to keep the incumulation bit in mind when you think about the way I think about equalitarianism, because I basically crib a lot of this insight from Richard Dawkins, who came up with the selfish gene idea and the idea of memes as communicable templates as well. And so the way Dawkins thinks about memes and genes is in an active sense. He thinks of them as responsible for creating organisms, essentially, and controlling them. He thinks of memes and genes as instructions for organisms. Okay, and I definitely think that is false. However, you do have to explain why that theory is so powerful and why it matches so many facts that we see. So, like, a better theory always has to explain the facts of the pre-existing theory in a better way, right? So I have to somehow explain why the selfish gene and meme theory is so good, right? Why it works and why it appears to be correct, even though it's false. And that reason is that genes and memes are templates for knowledge. So organisms integrate, they take their instructions from their environment and they accumulate knowledge, but they have to use heritable templates in order to do that. And they have to be communicable. So an organism uses this DNA code as a list of heritable templates. So how to make a protein doesn't have to be reinvented by every organism that's born. It inherits this template, this templated, list of base pairs that can be used by the cellular mechanism to encode proteins. So the messenger RNA goes to the DNA and takes a little message over to the ribosome and encodes a protein. When and where the proteins are expressed, which protein and when is controlled by the environment, but the instructions that come from the environment. However, it's a heritable template. And if you think about it, that's exactly what words are: symbols, memes. So memes are also templates. The way I'm combining words together in this lecture has never been done before. And it's based on the environment that I'm in. It's based on the knowledge that I've already accumulated. But I didn't invent these words. And the reason why they have meaning to other organisms is because they're templates, right? So you have, when I say the word you and the word have, you have in your brain a whole set of associations that have been accumulated by you to those templates, right? So you can make meaning out of those words. You don't just sit there and syntactically match words with other words, or words with symbols, or words with images, or anything like that. It's not like that. You have an understanding of how a word works in your world, and that's because you contain accumulated knowledge, but you're using templates. So templates have to be communicable. They have to be able to be spread. Genes are spread. So genes are spread both through reproduction, and that's how they get out into a population. Sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction. A single parent can produce many offspring, and that becomes a population. So that's one way that they're spread. Another way that they're spread, which is very common in single-celled life, is called horizontal gene transfer. And that's where one like species or strain of single-celled organism just conjugates with another strain and just they trade DNA. Why do they do that? They're totally different type of animals, right? But they get together, single-celled animals that are normally asexual, right? But they get together and they have sex across species, right? So it'd be like a whale having sex with a fish or something like that, you know. It's very strange, but we're talking about single-celled organisms like bacteria and archaea, that sort of thing. Prokaryotes, little bitty guys, single cells. So these guys get together and they conjugate. It's called horizontal gene transfer, and they transfer back and forth DNA. And that's another way that these templates can spread. Also, a third way is through viruses. Viruses can spread DNA, right? Because they get into cells. That's how viruses reproduce. They go into living cells, and the cellular machinery makes essentially a mistake and ends up replicating the virus and spreading the virus back into the environment. So that's how viruses persist. Viruses have packets of DNA. They're not alive because they don't incumulate. Got it? Not alive. However, they do have these transmissible templates that are genes, right? That are pieces of DNA, pieces of genetic code. So if you think about it, genes and memes, symbols, they work in a really similar way, and they're both binary. They're both like can be digital, right? So all the DNA in the world is just A, G, T, and C, just the amino acids, 4 amino acids that are form the genetic code. And symbols, you know, the symbols of human knowledge that we use to communicate can also obviously be represented in binary sequences as digital pieces of information. So that's a linear sequence of ones and zeros that is much like the DNA code. It can be unencoded by a computer or something like that to be turned back into meaningful artifacts that we can spread. And of course, the first of these templates were not digital; they were analog, right? They were cuneiform markings on clay tablets. As far as we know, those were the first writing. And of course, long before that, we had songs, we had words, we had, you know, words are just attenuated songs, right? Songs go all the way out into nature and to birds and whales and monkeys and all sorts of organisms sing songs to one another to communicate, and they have different patterns that they express feelings with and share knowledge, right? They have alarm calls, they have love calls, they have everything in between, you know, love, fear. Those are the kind of extremes, right? But there's everything in between. There's the sort of I'm just hanging out call. There's a I found food call. Those are songs, you know, they're musical. Music goes way out into nature. That's much more fundamental than language. And language is this kind of attenuated, shaped form of music that's much more specific. And you can imagine a long period of time where the calls of our Australopithecine, you know, ancestors got more and more sophisticated and subtle and applied more directly to more particular objects or particular situations and in more subtle ways. And as we began doing that, our brains developed in a certain pattern, and pretty soon we were talking. And then of course we were hunters that hunt by sight, and most of the people watching this video will never have hunted by sight, will never have tracked an animal before, never have tried to subsist on hunting large game by looking at footprints in the soil, in the ground, or ways that grass and trees have been impacted by the movement of animals to sort of interpret visual scene and tell a story. But that's exactly how you survive if you're a hunter, in the way that our ancestors would have been, with very simple, rudimentary tools, at first with no tools, right? I mean, so the earliest, Homo erectus didn't even have any spears. They just, presumably they chased animals until, and by tracking them and chasing them until they were exhausted and they could catch them, throttle them to death. But then they used spears and rocks, stones, and then bows and arrows, and then, pretty soon, high-powered rifles. But it's all based on this site-based hunting and collaboration with others. And we hunt like dogs. Dogs use their noses. Our noses are not very good. So we use our eyes to look at the ground and to unencode these markings in the soil. Well, it's turning those markings into a story of what took place. The antelope that we're looking for, it's wounded. I can see by the footprints, it's this antelope went this way, and this other antelope went that way. We should go this way towards the one that is wounded. And I can tell by the footprints, very subtle difference in its footprints from the other one. So I can tell a story with my companions based on those markings in the soil that allows me to hunt. Maybe that story is told at first just through music. It's some sort of song. I'll say, that way, and they go with me because I'm the leader. And that sort of communication of translating a visual symbol of a footprint into a story, communicating it verbally, or musically, that's how we evolved, right? That was our means of subsistence for many, many centuries, many millennia that we did that. That was our main way of getting protein. Of course, the gathering aspect that was more female dominated is a similar sort of process. You're looking into African, in the dry season, you're looking at these parched sticks in the African savanna, and you're figuring out which ones have tubers underneath them, right? So it's very subtle visual cues. You're telling a story to yourself. This little parched stick with a certain type of shriveled leaf on it means that down deep there's a tuber. And I'm telling my, my kin women, hey, let's dig here, because I can see this is what this means. So these visual cues are very similar. And so you can see how turning, a tablet of mud into cuneiform writing and symbolic communication is not that totally unnatural for us. And having been these group social hunters, with these visual skills and poor noses, that's key to it. You don't see this sort of thing developing in animals that have amazing noses because they don't need to tell a story, right? The nose tells it all. Like a dog, can sniff through 20 feet of solid concrete. They can smell things that are 10 miles away. So they can understand the whole story non-verbally and orient their activities without having to talk, because very much they talk a little bit, they certainly sing a little bit, but it's not as sophisticated because they have the use of this much more powerful olfactory organ that can integrate all that knowledge and tell the story. They'll know the story by smelling the ground. A dog can, or a wolf can come upon a track in the woods on the ground, and it can be 3 days old, and within minutes they'll go back and forth, they'll smell the trail, they go back and forth a little bit, and they know which way the animal was walking. So they can tell the difference in the way the scent was laid down, the instants, seconds between the time that the particles of scent were laid down in a line on a trail. They cast back and forth a little bit, and they say, he was walking this way, and they go the correct direction. They don't follow the trail the wrong way, which is the most amazing thing that a dog with a really good nose can do and a wolf can do. So, we're kind of lucky to be this mammal that didn't have a good nose and hunted by sight and hunted by long distance running and reading the ground, and of course gathered that way, gathered tubers and other food that way too. So I got off because I love that subject. But anyway, we're talking about templates. This is how templates are used by living systems. And now let's talk about the consequences of that use, right? Communicable use. So we've got competitive organisms. They're all trying to win the game, right? Survival of the fittest, right? It's a life or death struggle to reproduce yourself in nature. And those that don't win the struggle, they don't reproduce and they perish. So there are two conditions necessary for competition to keep going. One is that there has to be wins and losses. And the second is that something has to be shared from the winners through the rest of the community. In the case of genes, these templates are shared, right? They're communicated across throughout the community, right? Of that species, if it's a sexually reproducing species, or that lineage, if it's an asexual one, and also through conjugation and through viruses, they're shared between lineages. So what's the end result of this sharing? Well, in sexual reproducers like ourselves, there's a lot of recombination, right? There's a lot of sex. Sex gives you on average, 50% of the alleles of your mother and 50% of your father. And so you have a big mixture every single generation, a big pile on, a big spread, right? So something that's useful spreads a long way very rapidly. What's the result of that? Something that's harmful dies out quickly. Something that's very useful spreads rapidly. And the reason we have sexual reproduction has to do with parasitism, and that's a whole long explanation. It's very fascinating. And it has to do with preventing genetic disease and preventing parasitism. And that's why you see sexual reproduction in complex, large organisms that have long lives. And you don't see it in very small, simple organisms very often. Sometimes you do, not very often. But so where was that? Yeah, so they're shared. These templates are shared across the population, and the result of that sharing, intermixing, is a form of equality, equalitarianism. So the result is you have the formation of species. Bacteria don't really have species; they have lineages, but they don't. They grade from one to the other very gradually. They don't have sharp boundaries. Sexual reproducers have fairly sharp boundaries because you have a group, a species, which basically the species concept is a species is a group that can reproduce together. Basically, it's complicated. I mean, there's a lot of gray areas, but essentially a species is a group of organisms that can reproduce and create viable offspring together. So within a species, there's this equality arises. You don't see you see slight gradation across physical space, a geographic region. For example, if you look at a band of Africa, where you've got one species of antelope, okay, from the northern end of the range to the southern end of the range, there might be a slight gradation, but basically you're looking at a very similar organism, right? The stripes on its coat are going to be the same, the length of its legs and the way that it runs and the way that it groups together in the winter or dry season and does certain things at certain times. All that's going to be really similar. You're going to have a species so similar that for millennia, people believed that species were immutable, that they were just types that were given by heaven, that were sent down from the gods, put on earth, created 2 by 2 as individual items that had a perfect form, and it was an immutable form. So we had to invent the idea of evolution, because the natural thing to think when you look around and you see all these species is that everything of a certain type is basically the same. It's all similar. It's all equal. And why is it similar, right? Why does that happen? That happens because of competition. So equalitarianism, equality of opportunity is formed when you have transmissible templates that are spread among a population, because they all get the same opportunities because they all interchange their information. It's the informational level that is spread among the species that enforces that equality and makes them all look the same. Any of them that look especially bad get weeded out by natural selection. The ones that are especially good have more offspring, and the genes spread across the population. Pretty soon they all look that way, right? So whenever you look at evolution, it always involves, especially when you're talking about sexual reproduction, it involves the formation of these species. So why is this important? It's important because look around us. We have to explain the mania for producing equality of opportunity among humans. Now, this has never been part of human society. Why is there a mania? Why is it that information technology, we have to somehow explain all the changes in human society without referencing any biological changes in our bodies, right? Because we have the same bodies, we have the same cells, we're organized the same way as our ancestors a million years ago. But these vast changes in human society have happened so rapidly. So now we have like this just total mania for equality of opportunity, and it's a powerful force for moral progress and for good. And where did this come from? We've had inequality and slavery and complete oppression for millennia, right? And before that, before we had organized societies, we had the oppression of the strong against the weak in families, right, and kinship groups, and we had ways of kind of coping with that. But we had this intrinsic inequality in human affairs that goes way back, and so we're eradicating that. And it somehow has to do with information technology. It must, because that's the only thing that's changing, right, is our technology. Our society is changing because knowledge is changing. We're producing better knowledge. We're transmitting that knowledge more rapidly. Those templates, symbols of templated knowledge, are being transmitted at the speed of light all over the world by the internet now. And so this is creating a situation where the best ideas spread, the most useful ideas spread incredibly fast, and the worst ideas get suppressed incredibly fast. And so you have this is all producing equality of opportunity. This is my explanation for moral progress in human affairs. So that's a powerful idea. That's a good place to stop for now. I'm going to talk a lot more about moral progress in the third video, which is going to be about optimism and about why all of this theory that I've talked about should make us feel like the world is getting better fast instead of getting worse fast, because most of us feel like it's getting worse really quickly. And there's a very specific good reason for that, based on the combination of acceleration, equalitarianism, and incumulation. So I needed to introduce those three ideas before I talk about moral progress and optimism. But I'm going to sign off for now. Thanks, guys, for listening, and we'll be back with some question and answer in the next video. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.